Mitchell.
And I'm E.T. Mobley.
Welcome to today's episode of this Funkin Life podcast. Today we're going to be talking about one of our biggest influences, Sly Stone. We're going to talk about his music and what we've gotten out of it and how it's affected what we write. Eric, what are some of your favorite Sly songs?
Stand, and I'll also say Have Fun in the Summertime.
That's a good one. I think we can kind of break his output into a couple of different eras. There's the 67 to 71 period, when he first came out through There's a Riot Going On, and then after that, there were some personnel changes in the band, and then he came back with Fresh, and then through 79, where in my opinion, his last great album came out, which is called Back on the Right Track. He did put an album out in the early 80s, which is okay, but I don't think it really hangs in there with the rest of them. We're going to talk about some of the details of his songwriting style and what it means to us, and also some of the great songs off of the albums that were the most influential for us. Getting into his songwriting, I personally find there's a lot of humor in his lyrics. He's got some witty stuff that he always says. He does a lot of rhyming couplets, and sometimes on the surface it seems kind of, nursery rhymes, sing-songy stuff. But when you read them, it's hilarious. There's a lot of great stuff in there, and he's making a lot of clever insights about society and racial issues and other things. But he has a way of putting it that is disarming. It's not always right in your face. Sometimes he gets a little zinger in, and it's only if you really are paying attention that you get that out of the songs. I mean, you must have picked up on that too.
Yeah, I would say, so with the optimism of the 60s, the hippie movement, Sly and Family Stone was again another message band that always had something to say about social issues and the kind of world that they wanted to see, black and white people and all of that good stuff. Yes, extremely clever lyrics and just the ability to communicate those lyrics so that people would not be offended, like you said, but would somehow still understand.
Yeah, and I think that on his first really great album all the way through, which I guess most people would agree is Stand, you're going to have a dichotomy between songs that are very positive, where you have things like You Can Make It If You Try, and later on there's things like Everybody Is a Star, the year later. But then you had some dark stuff too. It was kind of starting to simmer. Don't Call Me N-Word.
We all know that one.
That one, that's a powerful song. And in the time, it called things out in a way that really hadn't been done before. And even years later when you hear it, it's kind of shocking, because now, we've tried to cut that word out of civil discourse, but it has its value coming from him because of the way he's framing it about, not using words to put people into a box just because of their skin color, and.
Yeah, I'll add to that, that song in particular. If you think about it, that song came out right around 1969, 68, 69. The year after Martin Luther King Jr. Was assassinated, and at the height of racism.
Yeah, and James Brown that year had Say It Loud. So I mean, there's a lot of consciousness going on about race, and he just framed it in a way by using that word that grabbed people's attention. That he put it right out there in everybody's face, and it's a pretty stark track to listen to, especially now. What I also love about that album, Stand, is he could write an incredible pop song with one chord.
That is true. Yeah.
Which is basically Everyday People. So that song has one chord chugging all the way through it, and it kind of flips to the 4 chord once in a while, going from the 1 to the 4. But basically, it's just a steady 8th note groove with over one solid chord, and that is his most popular song by far. If you look at Spotify, it's like 220 million streams. It's like more than 10 times more than any other song that people
Such a simple tune.
It is, and it just it illustrates his ability to write a compelling hook and lyrical message that resonates with everybody. And we try to take that to heart, because when you write a song, you want people to be able to sing along and feel like there's something that catches their attention and makes them want to listen to it again and again. That's just part of pop songwriting. If you're any kind of musician who wants to reach a large audience. So yeah, we're a funk band primarily, but we have elements that are drawn from people like Sly that show you that you can cross over with any kind of audience, because that's what he did. He reached the entire world, and you could argue that for about a year and a half, around 1970 to 71, he was the biggest artist in the world. And there was some competition, but he was right up there with anybody. And a lot of that was because his songs crossed over. So he could write some stank ass funk, but he could also put it across with like I said, a single chord chugging over an eighth note groove that everybody could relate to.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that he and Jimi Hendrix were like the first two African American artists to really cross over.
Yeah, you could probably say that. I mean, obviously you had Sam Cooke,
yes,
you had Ray Charles, but in a lot of ways they were kind of relegated to the soul music
R&B
corner, right? And they did have pop success in their own way, but Sly and Jimmy reached the younger generation more.
Correct.
So Jimmy had this whole new style of music that was very sonically raw and aggressive. And I guess you could say the only equivalent around that time would have been Cream, and he was influenced by that. But Jimmy's brand of music was so much more raw than anything that had come before, just because of the guitar tone and the ferocity that he played in. But his songs were the biggest songs in the world. He was, in his period, in the late 60s, he was the biggest artist in the world for a couple of years. So that's because he wrote songs that people could remember and they wanted to hear again and again. Getting back to Sly, musically, the bass playing in his songs has always resonated with me. As a bass fan and a bass player, there is a wealth of great bass playing. And everybody talks about Larry Graham. He was the father of slap and pop bass, and we all know that. But what most people don't realize is that Sly himself played on many of the greatest tracks, and especially going later into the 70s. Once Larry was out of the picture, Sly started playing some bass on the Fresh album.
Yes.
And probably before that, he probably played on some of the Riot Going On album. But there are some tracks, deeper into the 70s on High on You that are absolutely landmarks for me. Things like Who Do You Love? The feel on that track is so funky.
Let's not forget the side band Little Sister that he also played bass on, like You're the One. And speaking of that, Sly really established the very distinct style of songwriting with the bass. His music to me was easily recognizable because of the bass and the approach to the bass playing stylistically, with this kind of juddering.
That's right. And I think that all reached its head, especially as far as being in one of his most recognizable songs, which is one we've played a million times live, is If You Want Me to Stay. Because that has that signature bump, bum, bump, bum, bump, bum, bump, bum, bum, has that groove to it.
Very distinct.
And that, he used that in other songs prior, but that song in particular stands out because the bass is so obvious in the mix, and it's the backbone of that song. And it really drives it. And it's a simple tune. It has one long progression that just keeps circulating. It doesn't have any changes to it other than that. But that's all you really need. It's a great groove. So he illustrates, these are things that we take away from a lot of his music. It's just, if you got a cool groove, doesn't have to be too complicated. You don't have to get overly fancy. You don't have to play, a ton of notes. Just good ones. So I also want to recognize some of the other great bass players that left their mark. And obviously, the landmark track on the Fresh album for many of us is In Time, because that song starts out one way with the dun 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 dun, kind of has that steady groove, but then it goes into a whole other world. I mean, and that's Rusty Allen on that track, where it's a concept of playing that I don't think we really heard before that.
Correct. Rusty Allen was actually handpicked by Larry Graham upon Larry's exit of the band. Larry chose Rusty Allen during the emergence of the Little Sister act that Sly orchestrated as well. What I discovered was that Rusty Allen, around 1972, had started performing with Little Sister, started touring with Little Sister, and they were the opening act for Sly and the Family Stone.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Why you got that gig.
So it was kind of it was kind of a natural progression.
Yeah. He would have been one of the earliest and best people to carry what Larry Graham was doing further with Slap and Pop. He had a very controlled and steady groove on that. Very good thumb, excellent pop. I mean, just real solid Slap and Pop when that stuff was brand new. Because you can imagine that after "Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself" came out in 1970, everybody was playing catch up. Oh, I gotta learn this. I gotta learn how to do this.
Right.
But that technique is hard. It takes a while to really get good at it, and to get to the level where Rusty got to, he must have been on it like faster than most. He's one of the best to do it back then.
Right.
So yeah, In Time, incredible track, both the drums and the bass. It's just something to really behold if you listen to it carefully. The other thing about that track, which is part of the bass, part of the drums, but it's the syncopation of all the other instruments. And you can hear this in earlier albums too, but it really reaches its peak in stuff like In Time, where you're going to hear organ, you're going to hear guitar, you're going to hear little things that kind of chime in, like on the offbeats, like,
horns.
Right, horns especially, right?
Jerry Martini.
Those are all
Cynthia
like
Robinson.
stuttered. They're all like, everything is put into a little place where it's not interfering with something else. If you look at the spectrum of 16th notes going on, I'm not trying to get too technical here for the non-musicians, but if you got one eana, two eana, three eana, four eana, you might have the bass on the 2 and the 4 in certain places, and then you might have a horn hit on the which is an offbeat, and then the guitar comes in on the E, and then something else might be on the N. I mean, it's just it's a clever, very deep way of exploiting the whole rhythmic spectrum.
I think Sly in general was just, and this just goes to his genius in creating music. He was very, very clever at, like you say, putting all the pieces instrumentally together, and creating parts that complemented one another in nature.
And getting back to that as a precursor to the Fresh album, we've got to talk about Riot, because one of the other landmark tracks for me is Love and Hate. That song,
one of my favorite,
man, it just, there's something about it. It sounds like magic.
Yes, I agree. Very soulful. Again, the instrumentation, not many changes, but just a certain rawness and edginess.
And he'll come in after there's that vamp on the one chord, which is funky as hell. Then he'll come in with a series of chord changes that's totally cool.
Right.
It comes out of nowhere, but it fits right in there.
Right.
He does stuff throughout many of his songs and mixes where he pulls the volume like way down, like in the mix, and then he brings it back up again. He's kind of like in real time mixing the dynamics into the song. So that's an interesting approach. But Love and Hate is certainly one of the best examples of that syncopation, where things are just popping in and out rhythmically. Instruments are hitting in places where they have their own little space and they're not competing with everybody else that's doing their thing. The other thing that makes all that possible was the steady but kind of straight playing of Greg Errico. On the early era, like I was saying, the 67 to 71 era. The reason that everything could be so funky was because he laid it down so solid. And he wasn't trying to be the funkiest guy in the band all the time.
Correct. Yeah.
Sometimes the drums were funky. Other times, if you listen to Thank You, it's just a straight beat.
Yeah,
it's a kick snare pattern, right? Because the bass and everything else was funky.
Yeah, he certainly was not concerned about overfilling. It was about the steady groove, and that made the song.
It had to be an overall vision. It's probably, you have to stay with Sly, because he would have known that in order for everything else to do what it does and be funky, you have to have something that is keeping the time, but isn't
Absolutely.
interfering with all that. Because if too much stuff is going crazy at the same time, you get a mess.
Yes.
The one exception is In Time.
Yeah.
Because somehow that all works with what Andy Newmark
Andy
on the
Newmark.
drums and when Rusty was playing on the bass.
Yeah.
That's why it's a masterpiece, because they found a way to play that much without screwing around.
So right around 72, around that time, they were auditioning several drummers. Billy Cobham was one of them. And if anybody out there knows who Billy Cobham
Yeah, he's incredible.
he's just
Yeah.
a monster jazz fusion drummer who you just would have thought automatically would have been a shoe-in to,
Yeah.
to that group.
It would have been hard to get that guy to play less, though.
Yeah.
You can't imagine him playing something like Thank You and holding back.
Well,
'Cause
here you go.
He had unbelievable chops. Still does,
Exactly.
actually. Still out there doing it.
And so In Time was actually that was the track that Sly had Billy Cobham try to
Yeah.
play. Sly already had that drum line to In Time in his head that he was trying to communicate to Billy Cobham. But actually Sly wasn't quite satisfied with Billy Cobham's approach to that.
Right.
So they brought in Andy Newmark, and Andy nailed it, and he got the gig because of that. So
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that Sly was good at, was pulling together people. It didn't matter where you were from, how old you
Right.
were.
right,
I mean, if you could play,
what color you were?
right, of course. If you could play, then you were in.
Right.
Because he only valued what you brought to the music, and none of the other political scrap would have mattered. I guess another great example would be Bobby Vegas playing on High on You,
Yes.
which is another one of those Sly tracks that as soon as you hear it the first time, you're never going to forget it. And that is one of those tracks where you start trying to play it, and I was trying to play it finger style when I was younger, going, man, this is hard.
Yeah, the bass.
And I
jumps
didn't
out
realize
at
that he played pick style, because normally you associate finger style with Sly's music.
you. Extremely rhythmical approach.
Yeah, very, very rhythmic, very funky,
Yeah.
and it's also very, very percussive. That's because of the pick.
Yeah.
And to get that riff, get that jump
Absolutely.
in the octave and everything, you really kind of need that pick.
Yeah.
So Bobby Vega was a teenager when he played that song on the High on You album. Again, it's another example of a guy coming in for one track and just making his name forever because of how great that performance was,
Right.
and what it meant to a lot of people.
Right.
You could build a career on one song sometimes back then.
Great
if
point.
If you
Yeah.
laid it down, it's forever.
Absolutely.
And that's what happened with some people that played with Sly. I also want to talk about an album that when I was younger and I was first getting into Sly, this is probably in my early 20s, because at that point I was getting into soul and funk a lot and going through the catalog, listening to every Sly album, getting to know it. And I asked a friend of mine, hey, what's this album? Heard You Miss Me While I'm Back. He's like, oh, it's horrible. I was like, really? A Sly album? Horrible.
No,
And I valued his opinion because he's a good musician and a real funk fan.
Right.
So I kind of stayed away from it for a while. And then a couple years later, I did listen to it. And I'm like, oh my God, this
Right.
is so cool.
Right.
It's the kind of thing where I think if you expect Sly to be a certain thing all the time, maybe you'd be disappointed. But when I heard it, I heard a guy doing something, to use the word, fresh for him. He brought new sounds to his music. There was female vocals that were more prominent than ever before,
Right.
even though Rose had always been in the band. Now he had almost like a co-lead thing going on
Right.
with his other singers. And then he had things like flutes.
Yeah.
He had other instruments. He had Latin percussion.
Percussion.
In there. He had a lot of timbales.
Yeah.
So the title track for that, Heard You Miss Me, I'm Back, that is another landmark track for me.
The Heard You Miss Me, I'm Back album in '76, in my opinion, like you said, was his way of saying, you guys have heard me do this before. I'm just gonna come totally out of the bag here and come up with something totally different with flutes, percussion.
Yeah. And you can imagine the pressure he was under too to deliver another hit single, because it had been a while since he really had anything. He had a couple of minor chart hits, nothing too big off of High on You, because by then things were moving into more of a disco era by '76, and guys like him were kind of being pushed a little bit to the back burner.
Correct.
And James Brown too, for that
Absolutely.
matter.
Yep.
That's a guy who had to stoop low to record an album called The Original Disco Man in like '77 or '70. And these guys, for as fantastic as they were and influential, they felt the heat of the encroaching disco monster coming in. And there is an album that was remixed of Sly's tunes to a disco beat, which was called 10 Years Too Soon, I think.
Yeah.
And I've heard a couple of tracks off of that. I can't really bring myself to listen to the whole thing, but I've actually heard a couple of tracks that were kind of cool. I think High on You was put to a disco beat, which it's not my favorite because I love the original too much, but it's not terrible. You know, the disco version of High on You is okay, but the original version is the stuff right there. I don't even think that was his idea, that album.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, that was just probably a cash in, but in the middle of the worst year of the disco thing, he put out his last great album. And I love this album, and I got it right here. I'll show you guys.
Remember Who You Are.
that song. This album is called Back on the Right Track, and the hit off of this was called Remember Who You Are.
Correct.
And that song is another one of those magic tracks, man.
Which actually, I guess in all intents and purposes, would have been considered a disco song.
But you know what? He didn't quite ever stoop to the cliches. He never. To me, this is a pure ass funk album.
Right.
I mean, even Remember Who You Are, which could pass in a disco setting, is not a disco song.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, while other people like, you know, Rod Stewart and the Rolling Stones put out legit disco songs, if you want to call it that. He put out this album that has some of the funkiest stuff ever, and a lot of it is because he had a cat named Kenny Burke playing bass on it. And
Five Stair
again,
Steps.
Fantastic bass playing.
Yeah, Kenny Burke originally was with the First Family Band, actually prior to even Sly and the Family Stone, and prior to the Jackson 5, the Five Stair Steps. And Kenny was a totally established bass player in the 70s. But you know, getting back to Remember Who You Are, if you listen to that track, for me, that song really would have belonged on, like, you know, the album Fresh or something like that.
It could. It's timeless.
Right.
It's just a fantastic song. It's simple, just a couple of parts, but when that chorus kicks in, with that bass line, I mean, it is just, it's perfection.
Yeah.
And there's some other tracks on here that have really become some of my favorites. And what I love the most about it is it's just also unexpected. You don't expect such a great album out of 1979.
Absolutely.
Not funk.
Yeah.
You know, you expect Silver Convention. You know, you expect Donna Summer. You don't expect what this album is. And you know, he had not put an album out for a few years. The last one was from '76. That Heard You Miss Me While I'm Back.
Correct.
So this is Back on the Right Track. And it was a very fitting way to come back into the public eye, even though it wasn't a huge commercial success. And then, you know, of course, he took another few years before putting out his last album. And that's called Ain't But the One Way from, like, it was 83?
Yeah, and he also, after the Remember Who You Are, or Back on the Right Track album from '79, he did do some tracking and touring with Funkadelic.
Yeah, that's right. He was good friends with George.
A few years.
Right.
Very early 80s.
In case you're looking for this, you can find it on vinyl on eBay, but they reissued it. Charlie Groove Company reissued this in the 90s as Remember Who You Are. They called it Remember Who You Are. And I think they might have added a couple more tracks to it.
Yeah.
But definitely worth picking up that one. So I kind of got the bookends here for me. You got 69 and 79. His first, in my opinion, great album, and his last great album. Of course, everybody's got to have those too. He had a few albums before and one after, but that's kind of the essence of it. He had a 10-year run of just fantastic stuff with some gaps in between where he didn't put anything out. He would come back, sometimes better than ever. So everybody knows the early stuff, the Sly and the Family Stone stuff. They don't always know about the Sly Stone album, High on You, because he did that as a solo record. But to me, that's my favorite Sly record overall. I mean, I love all the other songs with the big hits and the pop stuff, but that to me is so much great funk on there.
Yeah, he was even moving into, which as you would describe it, as the Sly Stone era. Starting with the album Small Talk in '74, which our good friend Bill Lorton at that time was drumming for Sly and the Family Stone.
And he still had people like Freddie and Rose on that album, I believe.
That is
He still
correct.
had most
Rusty
of the
Allen as well.
right.
Yeah.
He still had most of the original band.
Jerry Martini.
So it was really with High on You and later that he really redid everything, and occasionally people would come back in and out.
Right.
So yeah, that was a very productive period for him, even though there's all kinds of crazy stories about his personal life and his addictions, if you want to call it that, whatever other things he got into. But the music, even when he was seemingly sounding stoned or just, not taking it seriously, there's a vibe there that is impossible to recreate. I mean, there's just something about his personality that comes through in this music that makes him one of a kind.
Yeah.
Let's get into the album Small Talk from 1974. This is the one where he's on the cover with his family, and most of the family Stone was still in the band at that time, and it features Rusty Allen on bass and Bill Lorden on drums, and there's some good cuts on there. That album didn't quite reach the same success as Fresh and certainly the earlier ones, but a couple of the standout tracks are Loose Booty and Time for Living. Totally different feels on both of those songs, but there's definitely some magic in those tracks. What are your impressions about Small Talk?
Yeah, just Sly going into a different direction expressively in his songwriting, where you really kind of see him entering into more of a solo artist, still having the same Sly and the Family Stone sound with Jerry Martini and Cynthia Robinson on horns and Rusty Allen.
I think by that point they'd also picked up Pat Rizzo.
Oh, that is correct.
Sax.
Yeah, another wonderful sax player. But yeah, Sly was you could tell that his songwriting, he was doing all the writing at that point in time. Whereas in the early 70s and late 60s, you could certainly hear Larry Graham's in some of those tunes. This stuff was more all about Sly, going into the High on You album as well.
There are things that he's done that, even though they would never occur to me, just the fact that he did them is a lesson. So, like for me, ever since I first heard the track Loose Booty, not to be confused with Funkadelic's Loose Booty from '72, but the chorus refrain, the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that is a crazy chant. It doesn't come off the tongue easily. It's an obscure biblical reference, and that's like front and center, the hook of the song.
Absolutely.
And my God, it's like, where does that come from? And if you read the story in the Bible about what that means, it makes sense that maybe he was feeling some heat. He was feeling a little persecuted and didn't want to have to, kiss anybody's ass or bow down to the man. I guess you could read into it whatever you want to, but I love that he went there with something that was so counter to having a pop hit. Can you imagine just writing that song and thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to have a stadium full of people singing Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego?
Well, and again, you're still talking about 1974. So this is 74. I'd have to say was at the very cusp and the beginning of disco. So it's that movement hadn't still came to full fruition at that point. You still had really just strong, funky songwriting. You talk about James Brown era, Sly and the Family Stone still in that era. Of course, Funkadelic and they were coming on the scene.
74 was a very strong year for funk.
Right.
And 75 could be argued was the apex of everything that had been building for the past 10 years.
At that time.
Just about everybody that was a serious funkster put out their best album. You got Tower Power, you got Sly with High on You.
Grand Central Station.
Oh my God, what he did that year is incredible. Yeah, I mean, it goes on and on. Even James Brown, who, had put some incredible albums out in the early 70s, he embraced some stuff in his sounds like clavinet that he hadn't really used before.
Absolutely.
So he had done another album called Sex Machine in 75, and he redid Sex Machine with clavinet. And I mean, for whatever reason, Earth, Wind, and Fire, that's the way of the world. I mean, the funk was
and then Stevie Wonder
supreme.
Always in that mix as well.
Well, he didn't put an album out that year. He had a car accident.
Oh my God! Whoa!
But 74 and 76, those are
the clavinet approach.
Right, the clavinet. He definitely made that hit. Yeah, so 75 was the height. You got two great Commodores records.
Herbie Hancock.
Herbie Hancock, Man-Child, that's right. So much was going on in 75. It has to be the greatest funk year of all time. But then things rapidly started falling off as people moved into sort of more of a monotonous disco beat. 76 had some highlights, but this is a topic for another episode, so we don't have to get too far into the encroachment of disco on the funk. So, Small Talk.
Yeah. Well, again, it's you just hear Sly going into his own approach to songwriting.
It's quirky.
Yeah, very, very avant-garde.
It wasn't as mass acceptance oriented. It wasn't, again, like with the monster hits that were on Stand. The things, the singles like Hot Fun in the Summertime and Thank You and other stuff on the Greatest Hits album.
Right.
Because the Greatest Hits album from 1970 actually has a couple of smash singles on it too. Hot Fun in the Summertime and Thank You. So he just had this output of incredible all-time classic hits. The songs were unique, but they were so broadly universal in their appeal that everybody could get into them. So then he started getting into some other things that were a little bit more unusual and probably lost him some of his hardcore audience of people that, well, maybe not hardcore, maybe the average pop fan who just liked, everyday people.
Right. I would say, from that album, I would say Loose Booty, may have been the so-called hit from that album.
Time for Living was
Time for
there
Living,
too.
another one as well. Yeah.
If you listen to Fresh is a more intimate album as far as the sound. There's less stuff going on a lot of those tracks.
Yeah.
It's more of a quiet approach. There's a lot more electric piano. But if you listen to Small Talk, it's a little raucous.
Yeah.
It's got density. There's some tracks like those two we just talked about that there's a lot going on there. He had his own studio, so he was piling stuff on, and it's very interesting to listen to the musical richness going on.
Right, exactly. Oh, by this time, Sly included a violin player. Sid Haig, I believe was his name.
We take a cue from that. We bring in musicians to play things that we hear that will make our music have more depth to it. So we also enjoy using strings. We love horns, obviously. We have horns in the band. Also, during the period around Small Talk, he first cut a song called Crossword Puzzle, which later came out on High on You. And it is one of the all-time greats of his. The groove is awesome. It's a very unusual bass lick. It's very, very cool for any bass players. You got to learn that lick. But the lyrics are super cool. Talking about a single mother, having a baby, and taking heat. I mean, the lyrics are clever. What I get out of that kind of stuff is his reversal of the order of words. Sometimes he doesn't always put the words in the most simplistic, obvious order. He's very creative and clever. He might put an adjective after the word instead of in front of it.
Right, exactly. What's also cool about that track is that track was on the Small Talk album, and he cut it in a different groove for that album. I think what he wanted to do for the High on You album was retrack it and make it much more funkier.
Yeah, well,
and he certainly did do that.
He definitely did that. We covered that once.
We
Remember
sure
that?
did.
That was like 10 years ago or something.
Very fun song.
Yeah.
And again, on High on You, I'm not saying that the cut of that track on the Small Talk album wasn't good, but certainly High on You had more of this heavy bass approach, which, if I'm not mistaken, Sly is playing bass on that.
He played bass on the majority of the High on You record.
God.
Which brings me to one of my all-time favorite Sly tracks. It may be my favorite one, which is called Who Do You Love, which has this fuzz overlay. So he's got the bass split, which is what you do. If you're going to play a fuzz bass, you normally have the clean track and you have the fuzz tone. And that song has such a swing to it. It is a swinging, nasty, funkin' groove, man. That has burned its way into my brain.
You and me both.
So I've written some of our stuff inspired by that. I mean, you don't want to steal anything, but the influence is inescapable. You have to love that track.
His talent, instrumentally also, not just, songwriting, but just his ability to play things. He never ceases to amaze me.
Right.
And then again, you're talking about 1975 at the height of funk. So yeah, of course that song is gonna be there.
that is definitely
Who Do You Love?
Top 5 greatest funky bass lines ever for me, man. That song is just ripping.
Yeah. I wonder if he plays that with a pick.
I don't know, man. I don't think so. To me, he always sounds like a fingerstyle player.
Right.
But I mean, who knows?
Right.
Maybe.
Right.
I also love the fact that song is raucous.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
raw.
There's female vocals in there that are loud and
right. There's nothing pretty about that song.
No, it's in your face,
right.
and it is just pure, joyous,
yeah.
raucous noise in the best possible way.
In addition to the lyrics, if you listen to the lyrics of that song, it's again, he's trying to, it's social. He goes there with not so much racial, but some racial, and but yeah, he's really talking about how people interact with one another.
Yeah, and what your neighbor needs.
Right.
I'll let you guys figure that one out.
Right.
And that album also has a really beautiful ballad called "My World."
Oh yeah,
and,
absolutely.
It's such a contrast because dynamically, it just kind of gets quiet. The song is pretty, and after all that funk, it's a nice break.
I got another one for you from that album, "Greed."
Oh yeah, Greed.
Again, the bass playing.
I know.
The bass
playing.
Greed. And I wonder if that's Vega or again Sly.
I've only heard that Bobby played the first cut.
Man.
I think it's got to be Sly.
Oh my God.
I've tried to track that information down over the years to see who played what, but it's a little vague. If you go on Wikipedia, it really looks like Sly played most of the bass on that album.
It's just incredible, man.
To me, that kind of sounds like Freddie on the chorus.
It could be.
The greedy part?
Yeah, that was him. That was both of them.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of exchanging lead vote. And more, can I say this? Kind of more freestyling in that section of the song, or in the chorus.
Yeah, because Sly does the greed, and then Freddie comes in with that part. I love that, man. Freddie always added so much to that band. He was a great guitar player, a fantastic singer.
I got something for you. So Freddie Stone, and this was like a never released song, written by Freddie Stone. It sounds just like Sly though singing.
Oh yeah.
And the instrumentation again, signature Sly and the Family Stone sound. But this song was called "Sitting on My Fanny," which had to have come out around '74. I'd asked our friend Bill Lorden if he played on that song, and he said no, that he thinks that it was Andy Newmark playing drums on that song. But just another very funky tune that I don't know if it ever reached radio or ever even charted, but just again, just speaks volumes to the creative levels of that family.
And Sly, similar to what James Brown had done in the 60s and what George Clinton had done in the 70s, he had some side projects that he produced and played on and wrote for. Never really got to the same level of exposure and success because he was probably just trying to keep his thing together. Mostly vehicles for his sisters, with extra groups that had overflow songs that he didn't really get around to recording.
Yeah, Little Sister was one of those side groups, which ended up, actually Little Sister toured with Sly and Family Stone even in the 60s, the late 60s. And then Sly again tried to make them their own group side project, early 70s. But then they just kept on performing and touring with the band in the early to mid 70s.
All of you folks who haven't read this book yet, you got to get it. If you're a Sly fan, it really helps to kind of bring it all together.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's in his voice. It seems to be mostly written by him. I mean,
I got my copy.
it's full of humor. It's full of the same kind of wordplay that you hear in his songs.
Yeah.
So it's really a joy. It's something that I never thought I would see, just because he was struggling with stuff over the years and didn't seem like he was going to be coming back out in public in any real meaningful way. He has obviously played some concerts in the last 10, 15 years. But the book really helps to encapsulate his life and explain what he was going through. So it's really a must-read for any Sly fan.
Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll catch you on the next episode of this Funkin' Life podcast.
Please check out our Patreon page below for all kinds of exclusive content from our band Calumet. We have live concert clips, there's photos, unreleased songs, and more. We really appreciate your support.